Well, we're going to move quickly here. So before there is EAG News, before there were blogs, before there were websites, there was School Reform News, one of the flagship newspapers of the Heartland Institute. For years, it has been an indispensable resource on what's going on across the country in school reform, and for many, it's still their primary news source for movements in school reform. Joy Pullmann's the editor of that newspaper, and she's our last speaker today.
On his NPR radio show, A Prairie Home Companion, Garrison Keillor begins every episode describing his fictional hometown of Lake Woebegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. Social scientists now study a Lake Woebegon effect, a pervasive tendency for people to overestimate their own achievements and abilities in relation to others. The science journal Wikipedia says the Lake Woebegon effect has been observed among CEOs, hedge fund managers, radio show hosts, college students, parents, and state education officials. Its influence on U.S. education, far from being funny, however, wastes money and minds. The Heartland Institute's top priority is spreading ideas that empower individuals. So in education policy, my job is to discover and think through what ways of arranging education actually do this and to spread the news. There are three things that you, I, and our neighbors need to assume the power and responsibility of arranging our communities to educate our children. The first is information, the second is motivation, and the third is a destination. Knowing basic facts about your public schools is the first meaningful step towards reform. I'm going to hit you with some information that will probably shock you and that will probably shock your neighbors if you take it home to them. The Lake Woebegon effect is strong in American education. In the latest Education Next poll, nearly a quarter of Americans polled said the nation's schools deserve a grade of A or B. But half of them said that their local schools deserved an A or B. Obviously, both of these cannot be true. A recent poll of Tennesseans found that 2/3 of them had no idea of what their state spent to educate each child or thought it was less than $4,000. The state actually spends about $9,000 per student, and poll results are similar in other states. Americans tend to think that schools are much better and much cheaper than they actually are, which is part of the problem. And boy, do we have a problem. The United States have been spending gobs of money on schools, but it hasn't done any good, as you've heard from Lindsay a few minutes ago. We now spend $600 billion a year on K-12 public education, an average of $13,000 per student. Now think about that and compare it to the average tuition at your local private school, but have seen absolutely no accompanying lift in student test scores. We spend more than every other industrialized country on education, except for Switzerland, but our students rank 25th out of 34 industrialized countries in math and similarly crappy in reading and science. Only 2/3 of school children remember ever discussing Congress or the Constitution in school. Even students from the nation's richest, smartest school districts in renowned suburbs like Orange County, California, and Fairfax, Virginia, can't top the test score averages of international students from developed nations that are comparable to the U.S. So the very first thing that anyone needs to know about U.S. education is that it is like all of our other national problems: overpriced, unaffordable, inefficient, frustrating, laden with bureaucracy, and harmful to our economy, our culture, our way of life, and our international competitiveness. As with Alcoholics Anonymous, acknowledging a problem is only the first step towards fixing it. What motivation do we have for acting? The most obvious motivation for doing anything from a conservative point of view is economic. Education and healthcare are both the largest portions of state budgets by far. They are also currently the only sectors of our economy projected to grow in the next several years, and both are monopolized by government. If and when these grow without market-based reform, they take us closer to big government and all of its attendant evils. A moribund economy, especially for young people as it is in France today, a loss of national character for people increasingly accustomed to entitlements, and off-the-cliff spending, which itself leads to state and national crises, as with Greece and the Eurozone today. There's another motivation for reforming education, and it explains why, as Lindsay has so well outlined, decentralizing and returning education to parent control is the policy that offers the best hope for a brighter future. This motivation is the self-government upon which our nation depends. It is the idea that parents are responsible for their children, and communities are responsible to ensure that the children within their borders can read, add, and understand the basics of government so they too can govern themselves. Why should we relinquish control from experts to parents? The shortest answer is, again, motivation. There are some excellent teachers out there, 3 of whom are in my family, but teachers cannot parent. And research consistently shows that family background and parental involvement is the biggest deciding factor in how well a child does in school. Beyond this, parents are the only ones who do not have conflicting motivations when it comes to getting the best education for their children. Well-meaning principals and teachers often do not fiercely search out and implement cutting-edge or highly personalized curriculum and teaching methods, even if doing so would benefit kids immensely, because implementing these is extremely difficult and they won't lose their jobs or social standing if they keep doing the same comfortable old thing. A mother has known her child since the very moment it appeared on earth. Mothers and fathers instinctively put their vulnerable children's needs above everything else because only they are motivated by the one thing that no one else has to the same degree: love. And love is its own reward, which is why it's so much more powerful than external rewards like paychecks, career achievement, and even smiling children who finally understand how to solve for X. This is a motivation that our education system currently blunts and twists, especially for poor and minority parents who already live in broken cultures and devastated families. U.S. education bureaucracy, instead of channeling this instinctive passion, extinguishes it. It encourages parents to think of school as free daycare rather than a privilege. You don't need to govern your children or yourself, the system says. We will take care of you. Returning power to the most disempowered is the way to reignite the individual's appetite for freedom and self-governance. Like parenting, freedom is difficult and messy, but it's also exhilarating and empowering. The only alternative is a continued growth of laziness and entitlement that forces government to step in and expand. Harnessing this deep, instinctive, unique parental motivation is the idea behind school choice and behind 2 of the Heartland Institute's favorite destinations for education reform: school vouchers and the parent trigger. The parent trigger would allow a majority of children, or parents of children in a failing school, to require by vote that the school close, be turned into a charter school, or dissolve and the attending children's education money follow them to the school their parents choose. It has already stirred up resounding civic engagement in the mostly poor minority communities that pull the trigger. It's one more example of how giving individuals the power and responsibility to control important decisions about their lives lifts them from the stupor of dependence and the bondage of bureaucracy. School vouchers, as you've heard from Lindsay, are a more long-term, substantive way to reorient the nation's behemoth education system into a nimble, innovative, and cost-efficient system that empowers parents and communities. What I've just done in explaining the information, motivation, and destination necessary for conservative education reform is a brief model of how you might structure conversations with your neighbors and your local education officials. These 3 elements are all necessary for people to realize the enormity of our problem and the imperative for reform. The most important principle to recognize in education is one conservatives uphold in every other area of policy: the primacy of individual responsibility of giving the most power possible to those closest to a situation. It may seem unintuitive to remove control from experts, but remember these thoughts from one of the wisest men on the folly of bureaucratic expertise. "I am wiser than other men," Socrates said, "because I know that I know nothing." That recognition pushed him to seek wisdom, just as love pushes parents to find the best education to prepare their child for a good life. These motivations will never emerge from systemic bureaucracy. As U.S. Representative Trent Frank said this week when proposing a constitutional parental rights amendment, there are really only 2 options when it comes to who will determine the substance of a child's education. It will either be a bureaucrat who does not know the child's name, or a parent who would pour out their last drop of blood for their child. Thank you.